are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies. Discussion is all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?
Yeah, I'm in the middle, so.
Good morning. My name is Jacob Perry, and I am a competition reporter for Politico. And over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to bring you through one of the hottest debates in the world of EU antitrust law, and it's a bit what to do about AI. And in particular, what role should the hyperscalers, or in other parts of the AI ecosystem as well, the major chip makers, play in Europe's AI future. So with me today, I have Björn Bormann, Director of Legal, Public Policy and Government Affairs at Get Your Guide, a German scale-up, and he's also, we'll get to this later, but someone who's deeply involved in drafting the German government's recent AI and competition report. I have Marietje Schaake, a non-resident fellow at Stanford University, and an advisor to the Open Markets Institute. Beside her, I have Nick Banasevic, Corporate Vice President, Global Head of Competition and Market Regulation at Microsoft, and a veteran of the European Commission's tech antitrust enforcement cases. And then finally, I have Simonetta Vezzoso, a tenured professor of competition policy and intellectual property at Università di Trento, and I would say a very important and interesting mind on digital competition policy topics. So to get started, I'm going to maybe ask a little bit what the current ecosystem looks like now, where there are choke points, where there are issues, and where competition issues might be particularly present. I'm going to start with you, Björn. Where do you see choke points? Where do you see problems? Where is the system not working?
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Maybe to start with a few words on Get Your Guide, so that people know where I'm coming from. So Get Your Guide is the global leader in travel experiences, which means everything that you do in destination when you travel. That can be like guided tours, museum tickets, boat tours, these kind of things. We are kind of a textbook scale-up with 1 billion in annual revenue and still pre-IPO. So that's why I'm happy to speak not only on Get Your Guide's behalf, but also in the interest of the entire scale-up ecosystem. So on your question, I think like what are the choke points? I think at the moment in AI, so the problem is not really that there's too few players or something. The problem is more that there are bottlenecks, and these bottlenecks come in particular from technical tying, when gatekeepers and like big tech, who are dominant in certain layers of the AI stack, use that market dominance in existing markets to basically conquer other markets. And the most important bottleneck that we have seen there, that we believe is like should be addressed now, is really AI chatbots, right? Because in particular for consumer-facing businesses, we believe that Google search and search, like classical search, will go away and will be replaced by chatbots. So the visibility that consumer-facing businesses get from search now will come through chatbots. That's why it's so important. And what we're seeing there is that like gatekeepers bundle their own chatbots in their existing products. If you take Google as an example, so Google bundles Gemini into Google Search, into Chrome, and into Android. And uses that market power in these existing very, very well-known products. And then the second problem on AI chatbots is within these chatbots. So some of the things that we see there are very similar to what we've seen in Google Search before. So self-preferencing of their own services are being displayed in a preferential way. And that's another issue to address, right? But I believe Nick has much more to say there due to his former experience.
Well, maybe I'll move to Nick, and I'll maybe repose the question to you. I mean, looking from Microsoft's perspective, I think one of the key talking points in this entire debate is what role for the hyperscalers. And I see figures thrown around from sort of the 60s to the 70% in terms of what the 2 or 3 Google, Amazon web services and Microsoft Azure represent. I've also increasingly heard in the last few months sort of counter narratives around neoclouds or around what the dynamics exactly are in the sector. Looking A, at where you might see choke points as a firm that's looking out, and then B, I'd be curious in response to whether Azure is a choke point. How do you think about those 2 questions?
Well, Azure has 20% of the market, and maybe I'll develop that a bit later in the panel. I think, thank you very much first for the invitation. It's really great to be here. But in terms of choke points, I think you have to, I'm an economist, or I used to be an economist. I'm not sure that I can say that anymore. You look at things in the traditional way that an economist would analyze things from an antitrust perspective. So simplifying broadly, you have 3 layers in the AI stack. You have the infrastructure layer, which is the hardware, the compute. You have the model layer in the middle, and then you have the app layer, which is the consumer or enterprise-facing distribution of products. And again, as I say, I'm simplifying a lot because you have sub-layers within those. And I think you can, from an antitrust competition perspective, analyze things in exactly the same way. That's a vertical stack, as you have in many other both digital and non-digital industries, and that has been analyzed many times in the past. And you really need to look at things in terms of potential bottlenecks, in terms of tying, distribution, exclusivity, interoperability, data access, in the same way that antitrust has been able to do for decades, and what each company is doing. We have an open approach. We host thousands of models on our platform. We have public APIs for model developers. But I think the real choke point, the main antitrust issue of the AI era, and I know there are lots of other very important issues around sovereignty that are legitimate and important to discuss, and that we will. But the main antitrust regulatory issue is the risk of history repeating itself in the AI ecosystem and in AI chatbots. And what I mean by that is that you had one company that for 20 plus years has now locked up search through distribution deals, exclusivity deals, through tying, and through an inherent data advantage. And that's been sanctioned globally, including in the EU and in the US. That company locked up distribution, and it had this data advantage. And I think you have a very real risk of the same thing happening now. The same company has locked up distribution on Android. Bjorn mentioned the interoperability issues within that as well. Through the recent deal with Apple, it's going to have its AI solution distributed on iOS devices as well. So it will have its AI chatbot everywhere, just like it did with search. And it has that inherent data advantage through search, through YouTube. And from its perspective, it's just a self-nourishing feedback loop, that distribution, that data, and it keeps on going to its benefit, but to the harm of the AI ecosystem as a whole. So I think that is the antitrust issue of the AI era, that one company does not entrench itself again at the heart of the AI ecosystem in a way that causes significant harm to the whole ecosystem.
So Minetta, I turn to you. Has the market tipped? Has AI tipped? Where are we? Is it too late for intervention, or is the space still ripe for intervention?
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. Well, it's a difficult question because it really depends on where you look at. For instance, agentic AI, it has not tipped yet, but of course there is the risk now of agentic AI being integrated into operating systems, into browsers as well. And so there is definitely a risk. Other areas, it has definitely already tipped, if you look at other layers. And we have actually a nice report, which has been released by the German AI and Competition Commission, exactly on these points.
I'll just briefly mention which Bjorn worked on. So just that.
Okay, so it's basically almost all the AI layers in the so-called AI stack. I'm not very confident that our general approach, our general antitrust approach to these issues is actually the right one. So the vertical, horizontal stuff, so it's much more ecosystems. We have to change antitrust because antitrust has not delivered in the past. But definitely it really depends on the type of layer. And they have said, well, we have to tackle all the layers. And they were actually very happy, I think, in the report to say that, for instance, now cloud has been we are starting tackling cloud based on the possible designation of providers of cloud services. But it's definitely, I think, the problem you mentioned, Bjorn, is very, very important because it's actually about capturing intent before consumers know about it and then directing them. So it's really escalation of manipulation as we shouldn't have in a fair economy, I would say.
Choice.
Yeah.
Marietje, I want to get you on this question of is Europe dependent on too few firms? And maybe you can, before we get to sort of the nitty-gritty, do you want to give sort of the broader picture of where this competition debate is taking place? I mean, what are the broader implications that should antitrust get it wrong? What happens?
Yeah, so I'm not, am I audible? No. I feel like my mic is not on.
Are we, can we?
I'll comment. Oh. Hello. Better? Yeah. Okay, excellent. So, based on my experience of having been a member of the European Parliament, because just so that everybody's aware, I'm not just, proudly on the advisory board of the Open Markets Institute. I used to also be an MEP between 2009 and 2019. I'm not an expert in antitrust, but I look at technology through the lens of democracy and the rule of law, really wondering how do we preserve a well-functioning checks and balance-based, accountable system where no one party has outsized power, whether that's the government or whether it's private actors. And so what I think the challenge is, and it's one that I've researched and written about for 5 to 10 years now, is that there's a lot of concentration of power, and it doesn't only have economic and competition implications, but it has systemic implications also for public services and for governance. So think about, you mentioned the impact on search and findability, audience, traffic to different sites like the ones of your company. But the same goes for news sources. We're, here invited by POLITICO. POLITICO, of course, will lose traffic as CNN has because of these summaries. And we have to really ask ourselves, what is the future of journalism in this context? Because most people access information online, and if they cannot be redirected and won't be redirected to the original source cannot make money and will just struggle. So I think it's important to see this concentration of power, on the one hand, in the hands of a few big tech/AI companies, most of them American, if you look at what European audiences use. But on top of that, the way in which the US administration under Donald Trump seeks to use these companies, and they are apparently willing to be used, to partner up, to find synthesis, to really collaborate. The way the Trump administration sees AI and its tech companies as an instrument for imperialism and for hegemony. And this is official policy. If you read the AI action plan, you will see the US seeks absolute dominance of America First AI. And I don't think that's in the EU's interest. So where I wrote about the concentration of power as a threat to democracy years ago without this additional layer of geopolitics and politics on top, I think that is now creating a cocktail that far exceeds what antitrust can solve. Now, as a member of European Parliament, I always looked with admiration at antitrust because it was one of the areas at the time that was actually not so politicized. It was seen as very technical, as very diligent, and as creating fairness. And so who could be against fairness? You know, even the most fanatic capitalists believed that fairness was good, and the progressives believed that sort of taming the abuse of power by big corporates was good. That era is over. I think it's been highly politicized, but it's also no longer fit for purpose, as you mentioned, because we have to understand the impact of the abuse of power, even if it's the abuse of market power, as being societal, as being on democracy, as being on fundamental rights, as being on national security. And so only treating this abuse of power, this outsized power, unchecked power with competition will just not solve that systemic nature. And so I make the case for having much more of a view of the societal impact of companies. It could be small tech companies too that have big societal impact. Think about spyware, for example, you know, the kind of technology that can be used for stealth access to people's devices, whether they be judges or journalists or opposition leaders. I think that's of a systemic nature and a threat to democracy. But it could also just be that there are only a handful of big foreign companies dictating the market and information and data conditions. And, you know, it's another way of looking at harm. So I think we need to be much more willing to look at what reality do we want to confront, and not only grab the tools that we have in our toolbox. We may just not have all the tools in our current toolbox and have to develop new ones.
No, and that's interesting. I think maybe it was in the late 2010s, early 2020s, we saw definitely in the United States under the Biden administration, a shift in the goals under Chair Lina Khan and the head of the U.S. Department of Justice, as antitrust wing, Jonathan Kanter, focus more on what are the societal implications. And at the same time, over here, Margaret de Vestager, towards the end of her term, that rhetoric started entering in as well. So Minetta, I turn to you. I mean, where does that, I mean, looking at AI, looking at the goals of antitrust, and I'll include the DMA in that, or the Digital Markets Act in that as well. What do you think those goals should be, and to what extent should these extra societal harms, these ones that are not so easy to quantify as, say, price, should they be incorporated or center and present?
Thank you very much. Very difficult answer to give to this question, because the fact is, well, first of all, antitrust has evolved. So since the first article I wrote on the Microsoft cases, US Microsoft cases, almost like 30 years ago, I mean, antitrust has changed. So we have seen last week, for instance, the draft guidelines for merger guidelines, draft merger guidelines have been released. And there you can see that, for instance, topics that would have been anathema, taboo just a few years ago are there. I mean, resilience and things like that. And so antitrust is changing, but I think one of the most difficult things we still have to tackle is that I cannot really express enough how bad the industrial organization economics approach to antitrust has been. So I'm an economist, okay? But I'm totally against that type of economics. So we need to have a different type of economics, perhaps more focused on things which really matter, which could also include societal goals, okay? It's not that economics is just mathematics, okay? You can have a broader perspective. And then we should, of course, now definitely concentrate more on the new issues posed by these technologies. Like, for instance, something that was mentioned about journalists and the fact that our collective cumulative knowledge has been appropriated by somebody and continue to be appropriated. These are the new issues that the new type of economics should deal with. So definitely we should incorporate new thinking into antitrust, move in that direction. We are already moving slowly in that direction. And then open up definitely in terms of connection between antitrust, AI Act, much more integration with the GDPR. I mean, we have a wonderful regulatory framework in Europe. We should mobilize it a little bit more for the good stuff.
Bjorn, maybe this would be a good point to turn back to you and the work of the Commission report, which was the advice that you delivered to German Minister Katarina Reike. do you want to talk a little bit about, what your message was to her, and what the Commission thinks can and should be achieved on the AI front?
Sure. Maybe to weigh in on the other value discussion first, just a quick thought there. So I think there are a couple of values that we're discussing. Right? You talked about democracy. We talked a lot about like innovation and sovereignty. And I think what these things have in common is really the basis for all of them is fair competition. If you don't have fair competition, you cannot innovate. You don't even get the money from investors to innovate because they ask the question, what if Google does it, right? So a level playing field really provides the basis. It cannot solve everything, but it's the base that we need for sovereignty, for innovation, also for European competitiveness. So that's, I think, my take there. And then on the Commission work, so I think the main principle that the AI Commission in Germany came up with is when you look at regulation, you cannot look at it as a monolith block, so to speak, but there are different buckets of regulations, right? It's like there's a bucket of regulation that is maybe, like hurting innovation or like makes things more complex and complicated. Maybe this is what we should have in mind when we talk about simplification, right? But then there's the other bucket that ensures fair competition, and I think this is where the DMA belongs, and the Commission said very clearly the DMA should not be simplified or whatever, it should be enforced. Right? That's one of the core messages. And then what does it exactly mean? In particular on AI, they also address the issue of chatbots, right? And then there's there are chatbots that are integrated, for example, in Google Search that can maybe be captured within the Google 6.5 case that is ongoing. And then there are standalone chatbots like Gemini or ChatGPT. And for those, they probably need to be designated as core platform services, right? So that's basically some of the main recommendations.
Richa, I want to bring you into this debate a bit on the goals of competition policy, but in particular how sovereignty is it's not a goal. We should be explicit, but it is the atmosphere in which a lot of the conversations are happening, for better or for worse. I think there is the argument that can be well made that if you are protecting firms at the behest of sovereignty, that could also backfire in certain ways. But on sovereignty as a goal, maybe do you want to sort of set there what you think and maybe what the conversation is of it?
Yeah, so the reason why we're talking about sovereignty is, of course, because the rapidly changing geopolitical reality for Europe makes us unnecessarily vulnerable. I'm old enough to remember that tech sovereignty was a word that had been claimed by the Chinese and by the Russians, and that Europeans and Americans wanted to stay far away from. But I think we have to recognize that the stakes of having sufficient control and choice over core services of such systemic nature, infrastructure, information flows, the ability to develop economically, but also to advance one's own national security interest, protecting one's citizens, is now so dependent on the way in which tech has sort of woven through as a layer of our lives that relying too much on companies for such core government tasks, plus as Europeans being so reliant on foreign companies to provide such core tasks, is too vulnerable, is something that's undesirable, and I think that's where we are. Plus, even the US is now looking to invest into building sovereign AI infrastructure for its army. So, this is now a trend that we see globally and is happening in Europe too. Indeed, I do not think that looking at the sovereignty agenda or goal through the competition lens will be enough, similar to what I just sketched. And you also have to be careful not to start picking winners and losers, and thereby, suggesting that the success of a company is not merited in sort of, true cutthroat competition, but that it's only because, a government leader has tapped it to be a champion that it's a champion at all. But it's more about facilitating more opportunities for European companies that, we have the talent, everybody knows, we have great startups and scale-ups, but a lot of them go to the US for capital. And I think the irony in this whole discussion about regulation, because Simonetta just said we have a great suite of regulations in Europe, is not the flavor of the day here in Brussels. I hate to bring it to you. I think the flavor of the day here in Brussels is that regulation is a problem. And then if we just simplify, this market will suddenly start booming. Well, I think that's an overpromise. I really don't think that that's what the omnibus is going to bring, but you know, the jury is out, we'll have to see. I think it's much more important to make sure we create conditions for companies to be successful across borders, remove barriers between ourselves, another recommendation of the Draghi report, and that we also seize the moment that US policies have put a lot of Americans working at tech firms, Europeans working at tech firms, others working at tech firms are in. Because a lot of people are deeply uncomfortable with the support that some of the tech companies are providing for the Trump administration, be it direct in the case of Palantir that's helping ICE to round up people that have, you know, unfavorable opinions or have to be checked for their visa status. Or in more indirect ways, by sitting in that front row of the inauguration, by paying for that golden ballroom, by essentially being silent in the face of the erosion of democratic norms, corruption that is happening in the United States. And I think that the CEOs of these big tech companies that are cheering this on, that are hoping to benefit opportunistically, are taking a huge gamble. And that by trying to actually bring talent to Europe now and to say, look, you can study freely here, you can work freely here, you can be who you want to be here. You know, if you're LGBTQI, you're safer here. If you're an immigrant, you know, we can get you on the right track here. So in other words, to look more comprehensively about what kind of steps are needed in this moment for Europe to create the conditions for success for businesses, not so much to pick winners and losers, which I don't think will help even the ones that are identified as winners. But again, we have to understand the challenge as much more than just one of economic policy.
So Nick, competition policy should not be picking winners and losers. What should the goals be? And be curious, in this time where, I mean, we've moved beyond price, we've incorporated innovation, resilience is the new byword, whatever that exactly means. It seems people have different opinions what they bring to it. What do you see as being a sort of sustainable set of expectations in terms of what the knife can do?
Yeah, it shouldn't be picking winners and losers. It should be policing the market in the way that it's always been designed to. I think to answer this most effectively, I need to pick up on what both Simonetta and Marietje were talking about. And on this, I don't think my answer has changed compared to when I was an official in the Commission. The debate has moved on and it's become more politicised, as you say, Marietje. But I think it's always been unfair to expect competition policy to do everything or to do things that are beyond its remit. So I think Simonetta's right that things are evolving and that kind of adaptation is normal, and you'd expect and hope that agencies become more adaptable and sophisticated as facts develop. But I think the basic structure has remained the same, and competition policy and associated regulation, by which I mean the DMA, should focus on those core goals. I think sovereignty is a very legitimate and understandable debate, not just in the EU, by the way. I think it's become a global issue. But I think it is important both to define sovereignty, what that means. That can have many different definitions. And that it's also important to make sure that the right instruments address the right goals. And so that you have a complementary set of policies that address what they're supposed to address. To come back to your original question, Jacob, I think that it remains as important as ever, especially when the environment has become more politicised, that competition policy is fact and evidence-based. I think the Commission has a good history over the years of deciding cases and issues based on their merits, notwithstanding the political environment around those cases. So I think that fact-based approach is critical. To take the DMA, which is obviously very topical and important, it's not competition policy as such, it's competition related. I think it flows from the competition rules. I would say that it's important equally there when you have assessments of, for example, whether to regulate the cloud there now. I think the DMA is not a sovereignty tool. I think I understand why it's being viewed what the Commission is doing in relation to the cloud in the sovereignty context.
These probes were announced, the Amazon Web Services and the Azure probes were announced on the European Sovereignty Day.
The Commission went to announce it, and I understand why. Again, I would say just a couple of things. I mean, let me first say, we take the DMA very seriously. We comply, we have intensive dialogue with the Commission, indirectly addressing what Marietje said. I mean, we have constructive and collaborative dialogues with the Commission, and we take that issue of compliance, not just with the DMA, but more generally, very seriously. We respect it, and that's very important for us to be both constructive, trustworthy, and to be seen as trustworthy. I think it is important, and this is my final answer to quote Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, that when you look at things like the cloud, that it is a rigorous fact-based assessment. You asked a question earlier. Actually, the cloud is amongst the most competitive of the AI infrastructure stack. Like I said, we have 20%. We see lots of new competitors growing. It doesn't feel like a market that needs to be regulated. Again, understanding the whole debate. My final word on this is a plea that there is a fair and objective assessment, and that it's non-discriminatory, by which I mean that you take account of the whole ecosystem. So if cloud is to be regulated, which we understand, again, the dynamic behind that, and we have a very constructive dialogue with the Commission on that, it doesn't make any sense for us when you have Google growing at 63%, when it has all those other links with its AI ecosystem that I talked about before, that 2 companies, but not 3, would be regulated. And I think if one company as important and as central to the AI ecosystem is left out, if you're doing that fact-based, evidence-based assessment, I think it risks, and it's not for me to speak for the regulators any longer, I think it risks undermining the goals if you don't have an objective, equal treatment of the issues in that respect.
Simonetta, do you wish to weigh in? You were citing the report from the AI Commission. One of their recommendations is to designate the major cloud providers. I don't know if you'd care to weigh in.
Well, of course, I think that there should be a good assessment now. They have 12 months to do the assessment, so we will see what comes out of this investigation. There is definitely a problem. I agree with you in the sense that why do we limit it to the 2 and not to the 3? I would go also for a Google designation, for sure. But the thing is, something we have to really worry about is the limited bandwidth that the DMA staff has. So that's a problem.
Very small staff as well.
Very small staff. I mean, they really work day and night, as far as I know. And the other thing is, because of one of the problems with the DMA, the architecture, I mean, they don't get the support by the national competition authorities, that's for sure. It's very limited support. And so that's really one of the issues of the DMA, which is very ambitious, which is great. I think we should be really enforcing it. There are some structural failures which we should tackle. One of them would be to give much more money for DMA enforcement. That would open bandwidth for instance, we hear very often also I mean, we know how how important open source is for our economy, for growth, etc. They struggle to have their voices heard. When they, for instance, now with all the stories with app stores, but many other things, web apps, I mean, they struggle. So they should have more resources, because the DMA is very ambitious, is a very good piece of legislation, which is actually also future-proofed in the sense you can amend it to some by delegated acts pretty easily, but they should have more resources, more staff, more technologies, and then perhaps to have much more dialogue, transparency, so that all civil society can participate more and give evidence and be able really to participate in the regulatory dialogues, which are a little bit too bilateral for the moment.
No, one of the criticisms that the DMA risks without transparency becoming a bit of a black box, and then it's only so long that interested parties want to be staring into a black box, which I think, Bjorn, maybe I'll turn to you. Get Your Guide does have has an interest, to say the least, of where the DMA ultimately lands on key questions to your business. What score do you give, and what do you see and expect at this time?
So what we definitely see there is massive under-enforcement at this point in time, right? In particular, on the most important case for us, and also not only for us, but for many customer-facing businesses, which is the Google 6.5 case on Google's self-preferencing of their own services within Google Search.
So this is what the search results page looks like.
Exactly, the search result page, and then you have services from Google on that page that are highlighted and ranked first, and these kind of things. So that's a massive focus area for us. And what we see there is that the case has been delayed for a year now, right? So it's 1 year overdue. It should have been decided a year ago. And what we're seeing now is also, or at least there have been reports in the press. So the German news outlet Handelsblatt reported that the decision was ready to be made, and then it got delayed by the political level of the Commission. That's a massive concern for us. Should that report be true? That should not happen, because not only for theoretical reasons, because we can't trade away our sovereignty and our laws, but for really practical reasons. I mean, this law, and in particular this case on Google Search, is so important for the European economy that we must take a decision there. I think that's a massive concern for us.
Do you think there's a risk that at some point third parties or European businesses stop looking to the DMA if it fails to deliver?
I don't know. I mean, at this point in time, we haven't lost our confidence and our hope. So we are still looking forward to a decision there, and to decisions in many other cases that have just been opened. But right now we don't see it.
Nick, I want to turn to you on sort of the instruments and how they're doing. Obviously, there is a bit of a political cloud insofar as the competition toolkit seems to exist in a different place in this commission than it did under Margrethe Vestager. Just the very least that the commissioner has a lot more on her plate than Margrethe Vestager did in her portfolio. How are you how do you assess the effectiveness of the way the tools are being used, and where should the Commission be going with these tools, given the sort of broader geopolitical context?
Well, I think I've got historical context, given my age. It's in some way a question that has been asked in the past: is competition policy fit for purpose? It was asked 25 years ago when the first digital cases were around. It was asked 10 years ago, 15 years ago when the next wave came. So I think it's a very valid question. Broadly speaking, analytically, I think that the structural analytical framework of antitrust law is fit for purpose. It's the same concepts, it's the same potential bottlenecks, potential problems of competition. So it's really about applying those in a smart and adaptable way, as Simonetta was saying. I think you do need to adapt, and I think the Commission is showing signs of that. I think the proof of the pudding of the merger guidelines will be in the eating. I don't think anyone will know until it's actually applied in specific cases. You have the 102 guidelines coming out soon as well. I think, again, the key, and again, I no longer speak for the Commission, but I believe that it wants to, and rightly and justifiably, be relevant, not be effective, not be seen to be doing cases too late or in too limited a way, which was some of the criticisms from the past. So I do come back to my very first point. I'm not going to repeat it, that there are significant and evident risks of harm that are happening now. And there are lots of issues around that in other regulatory domains, but there's a challenge, but also an opportunity for antitrust authorities around the world to demonstrate that antitrust law and associated regulation can deal with these issues, so that you don't have, again, the entrenchment of one company with long-lasting negative effects at the heart of the AI ecosystem.
Marita, I turn to you in terms of how this toolkit should be used. I mean, where do you see a good direction for competition policy in the next few years?
So I think ultimately all of this is very political, and so there's also limits, in my opinion, to just looking at tools. I think we need to just zoom out and look at the changing reality and see how the Commission is answering to that politically. Because what I've seen is a bit of a trap, and just before anyone misunderstands me, I'm a big believer in enforcing regulation that has been democratically established. I think it makes no sense to announce a law proudly, but not to have the means, the people, the ambition to enforce, because it will erode the legitimacy per se, and no matter what the case or the issue. But in tech, we've seen that because the EU has, for a long time, prided itself on being the super regulator, having an answer to the challenges that tech provides in many ways through regulation, I feel like it's sort of made member state governments lean back. If there's a problem, they're like, well, I mean, Brussels regulates, this is great, we have a solution for that. Instead of also drawing political lines in the sand that are necessary when the reality changes. And I think one of the biggest challenges that this European Commission faces is that it is still very diplomatic / nostalgic vis-a-vis the White House, and they're not the only ones. And if you do not set the tone properly about what is happening, that is absolutely unjustifiable for the US to attack the EU the way it does, politically, on market levels, even security-wise, basically on all levels, and that's a threat to us, then you do not draw the conclusions flowing from that. In other words, the strength with which you want to use your anti-coercion instrument, the strength with which you want to enforce the Digital Markets Act, the lines you may want to draw politically when an AI company develops a tool that allows for the undressing of women and children without their consent. This is not a question of, hey, let's look at what toolbox we need. This is a matter of, no, we are not accepting this. It is not a product that can go onto a market, and so may have to go to sort of criminal law instead, but to draw lines about what is and is not acceptable and where Europe wants to be in this moment in time and in this world. And I think the tension emerges between the sort of diplomatic, strategic, very deliberate tiptoeing around the White House and the message that all Europeans need to hear, be it startups, be it citizens, be it journalists, be it companies. What do we understand our task to be? What is asked of all of us to step up towards sovereignty or towards, strengthening our own democracy, towards contributing financially to defending our continent, to supporting Ukraine? This is a message that Europeans on average do not hear. And I think that this is very much political, much less about toolboxes. I think we have to appreciate that most citizens don't know or care about toolboxes anyway. But so I think we need to find the right balance, I'll end with that, between the sort of technocratic nature of policy and regulation, the political nature of policy and regulation. And I feel like sometimes the diversion to the nitty-gritty takes away from the need for political strength. And so I would double down on that if I had one advice to give this Commission.
And I think that's a great message for us to end on, that this is, well, of course, this is an instrument focused on the details, but it's not one that exists in a vacuum. Thank you very much for your attention. Up next, we have my colleague Eleanor Reagan, who is going to move on to data as an enabler for innovation. And please remain seated. She'll be up soon, and I will hand over now.